The Ole Miss Rebels take down the Georgia Bulldogs in what was an alt-right physical game by Ole Miss. Joe, I gotta throw this out there. After the game last year with Lane Kiffin and he loses to Georgia, Lane goes to the podium and says, and I quote, "We have to have better dudes up front," end quote. And then all of a sudden they go through the portal and they go and get these freak of natures on the defensive line. And boy, did it pay off as Ole Miss clips the Georgia Bulldogs yesterday.
I know that we're going to get to Georgia, and I'd love to spend the beginning of this talking about Ole Miss here because I've been critical of Lane Kiffin, and they showed up in the truest way that they needed to. There was every reason for them to completely fall off the map here and fall out of the playoff picture. Their season was on the line, and Lane Kiffin not only had his defense ready to come out swinging, but stared down adversity at the beginning of this game when Jackson Dart went down in a disastrous first drive where everybody assumed that the game was over. Austin Simmons comes into the game, leads a scoring drive, and then Jackson Dart starts to have an incredible performance the minute that he recovers or is back from his injury. I give a ton of credit to Lane Kiffin, who I criticize for his inability to step up in these big games and for overthinking game plans. I saw a head coach, a play caller, that was in his bag throughout the entirety of this game. Ole Miss was not able to find success running the football, especially early. They were able to get a couple of yards here and there. But what they were able to do is to realize that if they attack the middle of the field and if they spread out that Georgia secondary, that they were going to be able to pick up some huge chunk plays. They were able to completely outrun that Georgia defense. And all the credit has to go to Lane Kiffin. It was a tremendous, tremendous performance.
Joe, offensively, I'll just say this. They did score 28. They weren't anemic, right? Like, they weren't bad. But, man, I mean, that front seven absolutely dominated Georgia's offensive line. Joe, they had 5 sacks in the game. Jared Ivey had 2. Princely Yellen, who we talked about a lot during the offseason, coming from Florida and going to Ole Miss, and then Perkins had a sack as well. By the way, Georgia could not run the football. They tried. They were trying to run the football. You know, the thing that everybody kept saying was about Georgia is that you need to establish the running game. But we talked about in our preview, and we said this might not be the game that you need to try to do this. Because if you're going to try to do this against Ole Miss, you're going to play right into their hands. Joe, Walter Nolan's not going to get the credit that he deserves because he doesn't have the stats. He dominated in that interior all night long. I don't know what the status of J.J. Pegues is, but when J.J. Pegues is in, Joe, they're putting a defensive tackle in at quarterback on short yardage situations and is converting critical downs. That's how talented this Ole Miss team is. They have finally, this isn't a finesse Ole Miss 10-win football team. This is an Ole Miss football team that, quite honestly, they can line up and dominate you. And, Joe, we talk about parity in college football. There is no more parity of seeing what Ole Miss just did to Georgia because Ole Miss has never been able to get all of those dudes on that defensive line. Maybe a Robert Kimdichie or Patrick Willis way back in the day at linebacker, maybe. But the bottom line is now they got dudes. And, yes, they slipped up twice. But the defense in the front seven has been more consistent than anything all year. It's not the front seven's fault that they have lost at all, ever close. Joe, Lane Kiffin's back was up against the wall, and he responded. This was the one that he had to get, and he finally got it. I will say this too. Joe, they're finding a stride here, and I think Jackson Dart is arguably the most consistent quarterback in the SEC right now. And look, I hope the game ball.
Not to cut you off. Not arguably, he is the most. I mean, he's played the best as a passer.
Hey, well, I mean, if we're going to go week in week basis, there have been games where Jalen Milroe has had negative yardage. So if we're going to talk about from a holistic style point, a holistic point of view here, okay, he's been more consistent throughout the entire season. I know Milroe did what he did yesterday. We'll get to that next.
Yeah.
But Austin Simmons deserves a game ball. Joey comes right in, ready, prepared to go, 5 for 6, 64 yards, leads the scoring drive. He ties the game after a bad first series for Ole Miss. And Joe, it felt like from that point on, when you had Austin Simmons that came into the game, I'm like, you know what, man? They still might have a game. People were tweeting out after Jackson Dart came back, hey, man, are you sure that you don't want to leave this Simmons kid in? And Dart comes in and goes, not so fast, rookie. Not so fast. This is still my job. Joe, they're just really good, man. And you know Lane's going to find offense. If you give him enough time, he'll find enough. But it's got to be that Georgia was physically dominated on the on offense. That's what led to this one.
The biggest takeaway is separate from all that, because that's all very important. This is the best game that we've seen. And I was listening to another show, the Cover 3 Pod, that's the CBS Sports podcast. They brought up this might be the best program win in program history. Like, this might be the biggest win that they've had.
It's not remotely close.
It's still up there.
Let me not say remotely close.
Yeah, it's still up there. This is a pretty big win for them.
They beat Bama.
Okay.
Like pinnacle Nick Saban Bama.
Right. You're right. This, though, and the biggest reason why I kind of partially agree with that is that it sets them up to be a lock to get in the playoff right now. Because right now they have 2 losses. They're probably not going to go to the SEC championship game because they're in the middle
playoff game at home.
Right, they're in the middle of that kind of weird mix. They've got a bye week coming up, so they're going to have 2 losses to get into the playoff. And the final 2 games that they have are against Florida and Mississippi State. They get Mississippi State at home, and Florida is on the road. They are in the best position out of any team that I can think of, except for, maybe Oregon and Ohio State. And they've got to do their whole little dance where they face off with one another and blah, blah, blah. But I can't think of a team that isn't in the best possible pole position to get in the playoff, because they've got a great win. They've got a pretty good resume, and their worst loss is bad, but it's still at least a Power 4 loss. And it's not like Notre Dame's situation where their loss is to a G5 program. They're in a really, really good spot right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, man, they can beat you in many ways. And when you're that physical on your defensive line, Joe, again, you're going to – look, it's not even that they're stopping the run. Most defensive lines, Joe, that we talk about that are really good, they do one thing exceptionally well and maybe average in the other, right? Like, I mean, yeah, they can be a little leaky. Maybe they got some good edge guys or interior guys, whatever it may be. Joe, they're good everywhere. They lead the country in sacks. They're one of the best teams rush against the run. I mean, they're good everywhere. Chris Pupal is the best linebacker in the SEC. I am not listening to any other conversations. Yeah. He is everywhere. He might be undersized, but Joe, he is the most instinctual human being on the defensive side of the football that I've seen in the SEC all year. And that is with a lot of good defensive players in the SEC. But man, the bottom line here, Joe, they are dangerous and can be a national contender because of what they can do in their front seven. They're going to be in every game. I mean, maybe there's a situation where their defensive line is off. You know what? Again, what's the status of J.J. Pegues? I don't know. But here's what I do know. Joe, they're going to be a playoff team. And if you take this team lightly, God help you.
BetOnline remains your top spot for all of your live betting action and contests. NFL, college football, UFC, NHL are all in full swing. BetOnline is your number one source for wagering news, odds, trends, and predictions with both desktop and mobile access at any time. Head to BetOnline today and use promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for 50% off your first deposit. That is a 50% welcome bonus. BetOnline, where the game starts.